The wind howled across the Wyoming plains, carrying with it a biting cold that cut through bone and soul alike. Snow swirled in ghostly sheets, blotting out the horizon until the world seemed made of nothing but white and shadow. Through that desolate storm trudged Clara Bennett, her thin boots sinking into the drifts, her gloved hands clutching a small, battered suitcase, the last piece of her old life. She hadn't meant to end up here, miles from any town or familiar face, but life had a way of pushing a woman where she never planned to go. A year ago, she'd had a husband, a roof, and enough to eat. Then the fever came for him, swift and merciless. The debt he left behind was less kind still. His brother, a man of greed and cold eyes, had thrown her from their house the very morning of the funeral, saying he wouldn't feed a useless mouth. Since then, Clara had walked a long, hard road. She'd knocked on doors, asked for work, even scrubbed floors at a boarding house until her fingers cracked from lye and cold water. But winter had come early, and with it the work dried up. Now every innkeeper turned her away. Every rancher's wife shut the door in her face. A woman alone drew whispers, and worse, her breath came in short, harsh gasps as she pressed forward through the storm. Her skirts were stiff with frost, her shoes soaked through. She prayed, though not with much hope, that she'd find shelter before nightfall. When the sun dipped behind the clouds, she feared she wouldn't last another hour. That's when she saw it, a faint flicker of orange through the storm. A light. She followed it, stumbling more than walking, until at last a shape loomed before her, a ranch house set low against the wind, its windows glowing faintly through the snow. Smoke rose from the chimney, the scent of pine and wood fire cutting through the cold. Clara nearly wept at the sight. She hesitated at the door, hand trembling over the latch. Whoever lived here might not welcome a stranger, especially one as desperate as she looked. But death in the snow wasn't an option. She knocked. Once, twice, no answer. The third time, the door jerked open. A tall man filled the frame. His shoulders were broad beneath a worn wool shirt, his hair dark and unkempt. The firelight behind him revealed a face both strong and scarred, one side marred by burns that twisted from his temple to his jaw. His eyes, a cold gray blue, studied her in silence. "What do you want?" His voice was rough, low, the sound of gravel and solitude. Clara swallowed hard. "Shelter," she said. "Just for the night, please." He said nothing for a long moment. She thought he might shut the door in her face, but his gaze drifted over her shaking hands, her soaked hem, her blue lips, and something in his expression flickered, almost like pity. "There's a barn out back," he said finally. Her heart sank. "Sir, he sighed, stepping aside just enough to let the heat spill over her frozen body. "Come in before you freeze to death." Clara stepped over the threshold, clutching her suitcase to her chest as if it were armor. The warmth hit her like a wave, stealing her breath. The cabin smelled of pine, smoke, and something else, loneliness. The man shut the door behind her, the wind's cry cut off. "You can warm yourself by the fire," he muttered. "But don't think kindness comes free on this ranch." Clara met his eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want kindness, sir. Only a chance to earn a place to stay." Something like surprise crossed his face. Then he gave a slow nod. "We'll see," he said. And so began the night that changed both their fates. The night a desperate woman found warmth not only in a stranger's fire, but in the heart of a man who had long forgotten what it meant to care. The storm raged through the night, slamming against the windows and moaning around the corners of the old ranch house. Inside, Luke Harden sat at the table with his cup of black coffee gone cold, watching the stranger thaw out by the fire. The woman hadn't said much after stepping in. She'd taken off her soaked shawl, laid it near the flames, and sat with her hands outstretched, trembling from the chill. He wasn't sure why he'd let her in. He never did that, not anymore. Not since the war. Not since the fire. The world had taken too much from him already, and he'd learned to keep it at arm's length. But when he saw her standing there in the snow, small, shivering, defiant, something inside him had shifted. Luke wasn't a man who believed in chance. Out here on the plains, everything was earned. Every fence post driven into the frozen earth, every head of cattle saved from wolves and storms. Life demanded work, and it paid back mostly in scars. He rubbed a hand over his face, the rough burn marks under his palm a reminder of that truth. The woman looked up suddenly, her eyes soft but wary. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but steady. He grunted. "Don't thank me yet. You can stay until the storm breaks. After that, you'll need to move on." She nodded, though her face fell just slightly. "I understand. I can earn my keep while I'm here, cook, clean, whatever needs doing." Luke's jaw tightened. He didn't want her gratitude or her help. The last time he'd let someone close, he'd lost everything. But looking at her pale skin flushed from the firelight, her dress patched and worn, he couldn't bring himself to send her back into that storm. "What's your name?" he asked at last. "Clara Bennett." He nodded once. "Luke Harden." He rose to his feet, his frame filling the small room, and poured another cup of coffee. "There's stew on the stove. Eat. You'll need strength to work in the morning." Clara's eyes widened slightly. "You're putting me to work? If you're staying, you pull your weight," he said simply. "No charity here." A small smile tugged at her lips. "That suits me fine." Luke didn't smile back, but a strange warmth settled in his chest. He watched her eat, small bites at first, as if she wasn't used to being fed often. Her manners were careful, almost refined, which made him wonder who she'd been before ending up on his doorstep. But he didn't ask. Questions led to stories, and stories led to attachments. He'd had enough of both. When she finished, he showed her to the small room off the kitchen, a space that had once been meant for a ranch hand but hadn't been used in years. Dust clung to the walls and the narrow bed sagged in the middle, but Clara's face lit up like he'd given her a palace. "It's perfect," she whispered. Luke stood in the doorway studying her. The firelight from the other room cast a soft glow around her face, and for the first time in years the cabin didn't feel entirely empty. He gave a curt nod. "Get some rest. We'll start early." When he closed the door behind him, he leaned against the wall, listening to the faint sounds of her moving about. Setting her suitcase down, sighing softly before lying on the bed. It had been a long time since another human voice had filled this house. Too long. He told himself it didn't matter, that she'd leave when the weather cleared, that he didn't care. But as he stared into the dying fire, Luke Harden felt a flicker of something he thought the war had burned out of him forever. Hope. Morning came pale and cold, the storm finally spent. The world outside the cabin was wrapped in white silence. Snow piled high against the fences and the corrals. Inside, Clara awoke to the faint scent of coffee and wood smoke. For the first time in months, she'd slept through the night without dreaming of hunger or fear. She rose quietly, brushed out her hair, and straightened her simple dress before stepping into the main room. Luke Harden was already at the table, coat on, hat by his side, a map spread before him. The light from the window caught the scars on his cheek, and she wondered, not for the first time, what story lay behind them. "Coffee's on the stove," he said without looking up. Clara poured herself a cup, careful not to intrude. She was used to silence. It was the language of survival. But she knew she couldn't stay here on borrowed kindness. She had to make it right, had to earn her place before he sent her away. "I can start work today," she said softly, "if you'll let me." That made him glance up, his gray-blue eyes sharp as a hawk's. "You've got grit, I'll give you that. Most folks would have slept half the day after a night like that." "I've done enough sleeping in strangers' barns," she replied. "I'd rather have something to do." He studied her a moment longer, then leaned back in his chair. "All right, here's the deal. You can stay here until you save enough to move on, or until you decide you've had enough of my company. In exchange, you'll work for your keep. No charity, no favors." She nodded quickly. "Agreed. You cook?" "I can make a meal stretch farther than most," she said with a hint of pride. "Clean?" "Well enough to make a place look lived in again." "Good," he said, standing. "The bunkhouse hasn't been touched since last spring. You can start there. I'll check the herds." As he moved toward the door, Clara hesitated. "Mr. Harden?" He stopped, hand on the latch. "I don't mean to pry, but you live all the way out here alone." A shadow crossed his face, quick but unmistakable. "That's the way I like it." The finality in his tone warned her not to ask more. She simply nodded, watching as he stepped into the blinding sunlight and disappeared into the snow. The hours passed in quiet labor. Clara found buckets, scrub brushes, and a broom, setting to work on the bunkhouse. Dust coated everything. Cobwebs hung like lace from the rafters, but she didn't mind. Each stroke of her rag felt like reclaiming a bit of dignity. For the first time in months, she had a task that mattered. By midday, the bunkhouse smelled faintly of soap and pine. Luke returned to find her standing in the doorway, flushed from work, her hair falling loose from its pins. "You've been busy," he said. "Surprised." "I said I'd earn my keep," she answered, smiling faintly. He looked past her at the swept floor, the clean windows, the small fire she'd built in the stove. Something softened in his expression. "Looks better than it has in years." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the weary rancher and the woman who refused to quit. Outside, the snow sparkled under the sun, the land still and bright as glass. Then Luke cleared his throat and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small leather pouch and set it on the table inside the cabin. "There's flour, beans, and jerky. Use what you need for supper. Just don't waste it," Clara nodded. "I won't." As he left again to tend the stock, she touched the rough wooden table, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. Neither of them would admit it yet. But a silent promise had been made that morning, a bargain, not just for shelter or work, but for something deeper neither dared name. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Clara rose before dawn to start breakfast, her hands moving by instinct, mixing dough, boiling coffee, tending the fire. Luke would come in from the cold, his boots caked with frost, his hat pulled low, and sit at the table without a word. They spoke little at first, but silence between them began to soften, turning from distance to understanding. Luke was a man of few words, yet his presence filled the cabin. He moved with the steady patience of someone who had learned not to rush time, as though each moment was both burden and penance. When Clara offered to help with the horses, he gave her a doubtful look but didn't refuse. She proved capable, gentle with the animals, sure-footed despite the snow. He found himself watching her sometimes when she didn't notice, wondering how such quiet strength had come from someone so worn down by life. Clara, in turn, began to notice things about him. The way he flinched when the wind slammed the shutters, how his hand went to his cheek sometimes, tracing the burn scars that marked half his face, the way he avoided one locked door at the far end of the cabin, a room he never entered, not once. One afternoon, while Luke was out mending a fence, Clara went to fetch kindling from the back porch. The cold bit at her fingers, but something made her pause. The door to that closed room was slightly ajar, the lock old and rusted. She hesitated, telling herself it wasn't her business, but the wind pushed the door open with a long creak, and curiosity pulled her forward. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and memory. A child's toy horse lay on a shelf. A rocking chair sat near the window, a small quilt draped across its arm. On the wall hung a painting, smoke-stained but still bright, of a woman with warm eyes and a boy no older than 6. Clara's breath caught. The edges of the frame were charred. The quilt smelled faintly of smoke. She stepped back, heart pounding, realizing what she'd stumbled into. A room frozen in time. A family's ghost. When she turned, Luke was standing in the doorway. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, those pale, storm-colored eyes, were filled with something raw. "I told you not to go in there," he said quietly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "The door, I don't care." His voice cracked like a whip, sharper than she'd ever heard. "Get out!" Clara hurried past him, her cheeks burning. She didn't stop until she was outside, the freezing air biting at her lungs. She'd only wanted to understand, not to hurt him. But she'd seen too much, and now she knew. Those weren't just scars on his face, they were on his soul. When Luke finally came back inside that night, he found her sitting near the hearth, hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't look up. "I didn't mean to pry," she said softly. "I just saw the photo. You had a family." His jaw clenched. Had fire took the house? Took them too? Her throat tightened. "I'm sorry," he gave a rough, bitter laugh. "Sorry doesn't change much." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the fire snapping in the hearth. At last, Clara spoke again, her voice steady. "You're not the only one who's lost, Luke." Something in him shifted at the sound of his name. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, saw not pity in her eyes, but understanding. Neither spoke again that night. But when Luke rose to add another log to the fire, he didn't retreat to his room. Instead, he stayed in the chair across from her until sleep took them both. The ghosts of his past had been stirred, but for the first time in years, Luke Harden didn't feel entirely alone with them. By late February, winter had returned with a vengeance. The days grew darker, the nights longer, and the wind moaned through the valley like a restless spirit. Snowdrifts rose as high as the fence rails, and the air outside cut like glass. Inside the cabin, Clara and Luke worked side by side to keep the hearth burning and the stock alive, falling into an unspoken rhythm of survival and care. Clara had learned to read Luke in small ways, the way his brow furrowed when he was troubled, the distant look in his eyes when old memories crept close, and though he said little, she began to sense that her presence was changing something in him. The bitterness that once clung to his words seemed to thaw, replaced by a quieter kind of weariness. That evening, a storm rolled in from the north, black clouds swelling over the plains, lightning flashing across the dark sky. Luke came in from the barn just as the first flakes began to fall, his coat dusted white. "It's going to be a bad one," he said, shaking off the snow. "Worse than the last." Clara hurried to bolt the shutters while he checked the firewood. The wind began to shriek against the walls, and before long, the storm was upon them, snow beating the roof, thunder rumbling in the distance. "Nothing to do now but wait it out," Luke said, tossing another log into the fire. They sat across from each other at the table, the flicker of the flames painting their faces gold and shadow. For a while, they listened to the wind. Then Clara spoke softly. "You never told me what really happened." "To them." Luke froze, the firelight catching the hard lines of his face. "You don't need to know that." "Maybe not," she said. "But maybe you need to tell it." He stood and turned away, staring out the window where snow whirled against the glass. The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then in a low voice he began, "The war ended, but I came home with nothing. My wife Ellen tried to hold the place together, but I wasn't the same man. One night lightning hit the barn. The fire spread fast. I tried to get them out." His voice broke. "I got the boy halfway to the door before the roof gave in. Woke up outside with the scars and the memory of their screams. The rest was ashes." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She rose slowly and walked to him, her heart aching for the pain etched into every word. "You did what you could," she whispered. He shook his head, eyes glistening with firelight. "What I could wasn't enough." Without thinking, Clara reached out and took his hand, the one not marred by burns. He stiffened at first, then let her fingers curl around his. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind howled louder, but inside the cabin, a different kind of quiet took hold. Raw, fragile, and strangely peaceful. After a while, he looked down at her, his voice rough but softer than before. "You got no reason to stay here, Clara. You should have left weeks ago." "I could say the same about you," she said, a small smile ghosting her lips. "You hide here like the world already ended." "Maybe it hasn't." He gave a dry, almost disbelieving chuckle. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Maybe not," she said. "But I know what it means to lose everything. And I know what it's like to find something worth holding on to again." For a moment, the firelight seemed to draw them closer, his scarred face, her steady gaze. The storm raging around them like the world outside didn't matter. When the thunder rolled again, Luke didn't pull away. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reverent. "You should get some rest. Storm will still be here come morning." Clara nodded and turned toward her room, but at the doorway she glanced back. He was still standing by the fire, staring into the flames. Only this time his expression wasn't haunted, it was searching. And for the first time in years, Luke Harden didn't feel like the only soul left in the storm. When spring came, it came slow and hesitant, like the land wasn't sure it could trust warmth again. Snow melted into streams that carved through the ranch, and the grass began to push through the thawing earth. For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara Bennett could feel hope in the air, a sense of beginning. Life on the ranch took on a new rhythm. Clara's laughter began to echo in the kitchen. Luke's voice grew gentler when he spoke to her. They shared meals, stories, and sometimes, when the nights were quiet, a moment by the fire that felt dangerously close to comfort. Clara had stopped counting the days since she arrived. What began as a temporary arrangement had turned into something neither of them could easily name. But in a town as small as Pine Ridge, nothing stayed quiet for long. One morning, Clara rode into town to trade eggs and flour. As she entered the general store, she could feel the eyes on her. Two women by the counter whispered behind gloved hands. The shopkeeper's smile was polite but tight. "Morning, Mrs. Bennet," he said carefully. "Heard you've been keeping house for Luke Harden." Clara's heart skipped. "I'm helping him until he finds more hands for spring work." "Mm-hmm." He weighed her flour, then added softly, "Folks are talking, you know, about a lady living alone out there with a man like him." Her stomach twisted. A man like him? He cleared his throat, not meeting her eyes. Scarred, angry, keeps to himself. Some say he's not right since the fire. Others say no decent woman should be staying under his roof without a ring. Clara bit her lip hard enough to draw blood. She gathered her parcels and left without another word. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual. Each word replayed in her mind. Not right. No decent woman. She'd endured worse in her life, but this time the shame wasn't for herself. It was for Luke. He'd done nothing but show her kindness, and now he'd be the one paying for gossip he never asked for. When she returned, Luke was chopping wood by the barn. She dismounted, clutching her skirts. "Luke," she began, "the town's talking." He stopped mid-swing. "About what?" "Us, about me being here." His jaw tightened. "Let them talk." "You don't understand. I said let them talk," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut. Clara flinched. "It's not just talk. They're saying things about you, about me. You can't pretend it doesn't matter." He turned to face her, eyes cold as steel. "I stopped caring what people think a long time ago, Clara. You should too." "I can't," she cried. "You may be able to live with ghosts and silence, but I can't live as a scandal in someone else's story." The words hung heavy between them, the wind carrying the last of winter's chill. Luke's expression hardened. "Maybe you should leave then." Her breath caught. "Is that what you want?" He hesitated, just long enough for her to see the truth behind the anger. "It's what's best," he said finally. "You deserve a better life than this." She stared at him, her heart breaking. "You're wrong, Luke. You think you're protecting me, but all you're doing is hiding." He looked away. "Pack your things. I'll take you to town tomorrow." Clara felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She turned toward the cabin, each step heavy, her chest hollow. That night she didn't sit by the fire. She packed her few belongings in silence. Luke stayed outside for hours, chopping wood long after the sun went down, as though the sound of the axe could drown the ache in his chest. When dawn broke, Clara's place by the hearth was empty, and for the first time in months, Luke's house was silent again, just as it had been before she came. Only this time the silence felt unbearable. 3 days had passed since Clara left the ranch, though to Luke Harden it felt like a lifetime. The house was quiet again, too quiet. Every sound echoed. The creak of the floorboards, the whistle of the wind through the cracks, the faint clatter of his cup on the table. Her laughter no longer lingered in the air. The cabin that once felt like a refuge now felt like a tomb. He tried to busy himself, mending fences, checking the herd, splitting wood until his arms burned, but the stillness inside him only grew. Clara's absence had hollowed out what little peace he'd built. He told himself he'd done the right thing, sending her away before the town could ruin her reputation. But when he went to her empty room and saw the quilt she'd mended, neatly folded on the bed, he realized the truth. He hadn't been protecting her. He'd been protecting himself from love, from hope, from the chance to live again. That night the wind began to shift. He could smell rain on the air, the heavy scent of a coming storm. Lightning flashed across the plains and a low rumble rolled through the valley. Luke stepped out onto the porch, staring toward the dark horizon, and that's when he saw it. A flicker of orange light, faint but unmistakable, rising from the direction of the barn. His heart seized. God, no. He bolted toward the stables, shouting for the horses. The storm had brought lightning again, striking the roof just as it had all those years ago. Flames climbed fast, licking through dry hay and wood beams, the fire roaring louder than the thunder above. Luke ran inside, throwing open stall doors, slapping at panicked horses to drive them out. Smoke burned his lungs, but he didn't stop, not this time. Not again. The past would not take more from him. Then he heard it. Her voice. "Luke." Through the haze, Clara appeared, rain-soaked and breathless, her skirts muddied, her face pale with fear. "What in God's name are you doing here?" he shouted, half furious, half stunned. "I saw the fire from town," she gasped. "I couldn't just stay." He grabbed her arm, pulling her aside as a beam crashed near them. "You shouldn't have come back." "Neither should you," she shot back. But here we are. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other through the smoke and chaos, their eyes saying what neither had dared before. Then another crack split the air as the roof began to give way. Luke shoved her toward the open door. "Go, Clara." "Get out. Not without you." The heat was unbearable. He coughed, dragging her through the smoke until they burst into the rain-soaked night. The two of them stumbled clear just as the barn collapsed in a roar of fire and splintered wood. They fell to the ground, gasping for air, rain pouring down on them both. Luke's arms were around her before he realized it, his body trembling as much from emotion as from exhaustion. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered. Clara looked up, her eyes glistening. "You did," she said softly, "but you found me again." He cupped her face, thumb brushing a smear of ash from her cheek. "I was a fool to send you away." She smiled faintly, tears mixing with rain. "Took you long enough to realize it." He let out a rough, broken laugh, the first real one in years, and drew her close, their foreheads touching as the fire hissed in the downpour behind them. For a long while, they just sat there, two souls who'd been burned and scarred by life, yet somehow still standing. When the last of the flames faded and the rain softened, Luke spoke again, his voice quiet but sure. "Come home, Clara. For good this time." She didn't answer with words. She only took his hand and held it tight, choosing him, choosing the life they'd both been afraid to claim. And for the first time since the night the fire had taken everything, Luke Harden didn't feel haunted anymore. The past had burned away, and from the ashes something new was finally beginning. Spring settled over the Wyoming plains like a long-awaited promise. The snow melted into streams that fed the earth, and the land around the Harden ranch came alive again. Green shoots pushing through the soil, the air filled with the scent of pine and wet grass. For the first time in years, Luke Harden felt the world breathe again. The barn was gone, reduced to a blackened foundation and a heap of charred timbers, but the loss didn't carry the same kind of weight it once had. The ghosts that had lived there, the fire, the grief, the endless guilt, had finally burned out with the last storm, and Clara Bennett was still there. She moved through the cabin like sunlight, quiet, steady, bringing warmth to every corner. When Luke came in from the pastures, he'd find her humming softly while kneading bread, her sleeves rolled up, her hair loose from its pins. He didn't know when her presence had become part of the place. But now he couldn't imagine the ranch without her. They rebuilt the barn together, board by board, the rhythm of work binding them closer than words ever could. When the townsfolk came by, curious after the fire, they found Luke changed. The scarred rancher who once turned everyone away now met them with calm eyes and steady hands. Clara stood beside him, unashamed and unafraid, and the whispers that once followed them began to fade like old smoke. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned gold, Luke stood on the porch watching Clara hang linens to dry. The breeze lifted the white cloth around her, and for a moment the sight caught him so deep in the chest that he forgot to breathe. He walked toward her, slow, his boots crunching on the dirt. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. She smiled, glancing up from her work. "That sounds dangerous." He chuckled, a sound she'd coaxed out of him more in the past month than he'd made in years. "Maybe, but I think it's time I stop living like the man I used to be." Clara tilted her head, curious. "And what kind of man do you want to be, Luke Harden?" He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small silver ring, tarnished, simple, worn smooth by time. The kind who doesn't let fear keep him from holding on to what matters. Her breath caught as he took her hand. The wind stilled, the whole valley seeming to pause around them. "I don't have much to offer," he said softly, "but I've got this land, these hands, and what's left of my heart. If you can live with that, I'd be proud to call you my wife." Tears shimmered in her eyes as she looked at him, the man who'd once hidden from life, now standing open and unguarded before her. "Luke," she whispered, "you've already given me more than I ever dreamed of. A home, a place to belong." He slipped the ring onto her finger, rough hands trembling just slightly. "Then let's make it official." She leaned up and kissed him, gentle at first, then with a quiet certainty that spoke of two hearts finally at peace. The setting sun bathed them in light, the world around them washed in gold and new beginnings. Later that night, they sat by the fire, the same hearth that had once witnessed their silences, their fears, and now their peace. Luke had built a small cradle from the wood salvaged from the barn, its edges smooth and curved. He set it gently by the wall. "Just in case," he said. a shy smile ghosting his lips. Clara's eyes softened. You really think there's room for a future here? Luke looked around the cabin, the firelight dancing on the walls, the smell of fresh bread cooling, the sound of wind through the open window, and nodded. There's room for everything here now. Outside, the last of the snow melted into the soil, feeding new life into the earth. And inside that quiet cabin, a man once broken and a woman once lost found something they'd both thought impossible. Not just shelter or survival, but a love strong enough to rebuild everything from the ashes.